100 years ago, when Judith Kaplan became the first American girl to have a Bat Mitzvah ceremony on March 18, 1922, at the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, she had no idea that her actions would change Jewish communal life forever. But something unexpected happened along the way. As increasing numbers of girls ascended the bima, girls and women began to expect and demand access to ritual honors and synagogue leadership. Bat mitzvah first were a catalyst for expanding all women's participation in Jewish life and paved the way for young women to mark their coming of age in new and inclusive ways. As you'll soon see, there's no more appropriate person, not just here at Beth Yeshurun or in Houston, but perhaps in the world, to speak more about the first bat mitzvah than our own Dr. Daniel Musher. It's now my honor to welcome Dr. Musher to the bima.
Thank you, Rabbi and Ellie. Thanks. I'm glad to have an opportunity to share your bat mitzvah with you. The rabbi already took away my opening comments, and he hadn't even seen them. So we'll see what I have to do. It is true that it was 100 years ago, my grandfather, Mordecai Kaplan, called his oldest daughter, my Aunt Judith, to read from the Chumash on Shabbat morning at what was the first ceremony ever in which a girl became a bat mitzvah. My mother, the younger sister, followed 2 years later, and from those humble beginnings came the bat mitzvah ceremony, which is now observed in all Reform, Reconstructionist, and conservative synagogues, and in one form or another in many Orthodox ones as well. Rabbi Strauss graciously invited me to speak on the subject. There have been many articles in the press. I hope that you've read some of them. I decided to address with you briefly tonight the question of what motivated my grandfather to do this. And I may have some insight into the subject beyond what has appeared so widely in the Jewish press. So let's begin, in fact, with my grandfather's father, Rabbi Israel Kaplan, whom I never knew. He was a well-known scholar who traveled from one yeshiva to another until that's what they did in those days in the old country. The scholars traveled from one yeshiva to another to study, and their wives had stayed home and worked and raised the children. And that was what life was like in the late 19th century. My grandfather did that until he was invited to New York around 1887 to become assistant to the de facto chief rabbi of the Orthodox community. Back in Vilna, my grandmother ran a store to support her two children and to supervise the equal education of these two children. And that was most unusual because my grandfather was one and the other was a sister, my great Aunt Sophie. It was most unusual in those times for a girl to receive an education the same as a boy. Jewish girls simply didn't learn Hebrew. They didn't study Torah. They didn't learn what boys were taught. So my grandfather, from his early childhood, was exposed to an atmosphere of egalitarianism. When his first daughter was born in 1910, he began by educating her in the same fashion as he did with all his four children, who happened to be daughters, and in the same fashion as his father had raised his sister. So this is probably some insight that you were not aware of, that my grandfather's home was egalitarian from his childhood. Now, I want to drop back to 1889, because this is also relevant. That was the year that my grandmother, my grandmother brought, let me see if I can get this straight. My great-grandmother brought my grandfather and my great-aunt on a ship leaving from Marseille. It was July of 1889. So what was happening in July of 1889? It was the 100th anniversary of Bastille Day. And my grandfather was a kid, he was 8 years old. He was on a French ship, the 100th anniversary of Bastille Day, and there were fireworks. His mother, my great-grandmother, was a very stern woman. And he wanted to go up and watch the fireworks. He was just a kid. And she said, "That's not for us Jews." Now think of the irony of that. They're coming to a democratic country to escape what was going on in Europe, what had gone in Europe for generations. They're coming to a democratic country, and my great-grandmother is telling my grandfather, "Well, we don't do that." My grandfather was later to say that this was the beginning of his philosophy of Jews living in two civilizations. And I think that's terribly important, and it is relevant to the Bat Mitzvah, which I'll come back to in a moment. So as someone who was raised in two civilizations, my grandfather participated in writing a book called The Faith of America, in which he teamed up with a professor of Christian philosophy at Williams University, and they wrote prayers that were appropriate for the American holidays. That's how devoted he was to American civilization. His devotion to Jewish civilization was, of course, astonishing. He was strictly observant in his practice throughout his life. He never rode on the Sabbath. He certainly never ate food that wasn't kosher. He was in shul as he was supposed to be. And I emphasize that because I can't say that a lot of his followers are the same or even know that fact. So he was really totally committed to both civilizations. And I think that this describes how Carol and I tried to raise our three children with a deep commitment to Judaism and to the American civilization. So now I return to the subject of the Bat Mitzvah, 1922, 100 years ago. Young Judith Kaplan, 12 years old, that's the age of adulthood for young women, as declared in the Mishnah. For boys, it's 13. Boys are a little less mature, as everybody knows. What had happened in American civilization as my Aunt Judy was growing up? The women's suffrage movement was finally successful, and Congress passed the 19th Amendment, giving women an equal right to vote in 1920. So Grandpa was truly living in two civilizations. He had been raised to know that girls should be educated equally, and he now saw that the country to which he had emigrated finally accepted women to be able to vote, finally gave women rights. So it was in both of his civilizations that he was seeing an egalitarian tendency. And I believe it was the convergence of these factors that led him to ask my young aunt whether she would be willing to come up to the front of the synagogue after her 12th birthday and read a section from the Chumash, not from the Torah itself. He hadn't moved that rapidly yet, and to give a translation of it, which she agreed, and I think she was not 100% happy with the idea. No 12-year-old girl wants to get up and show off in front of a whole congregation doing something that nobody ever done before. But that really was what happened with the first Bat Mitzvah. In accord with my grandfather's views that Judaism was an evolving religious civilization, there should be evolution, not revolution. And therefore, it was several decades before our synagogue in New York started to give women aliyot. In between, there were occasions when girls were called up to the Torah, and there was one young woman who had read the Shirat Yam, the song of Moses crossing the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds. She read that for her Bat Mitzvah, and she was invited back for subsequent years to read the Torah for that portion. But in general, girls had a Bat Mitzvah, and then that was the end of their participation in Jewish services. So it took some time before my grandfather got his followers, his congregation, to accept the notion that if you've done that, then the young girls, as they grow up, become women, young women, they should be called back to the Torah for aliyot. And it was then another couple of decades before the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College ordained the first woman rabbi. Congregation Beth Yeshurun now has Rabbi Sarah Fort sitting on our bima, and Cantor Goldman arriving soon as we say farewell to our Cantor Mayor Finkelstein. I should state that our daughters, Carol's and my daughters, received the same Jewish education as our son Benjamin. Many of you have heard Benjamin read Torah and daven in the sanctuary. You haven't heard Rebecca and Deborah do that because they live in different cities. Rebecca has served as the cantor for the High Holy Days at Congregation Orami for the past 30 years. I think that's the longest standing pulpit in the city. And Deborah has prepared numerous boys and girls to come Benot Mitzvah. So, Ellie, you see that you fit in very well with the occasion, the 100th anniversary, as you celebrate your Bat Mitzvah tonight. Shabbat Shalom.
Daniel, thank you. It's important for all of us to know the tradition and the history, not just for adults, but especially our children, that there's a lot of history that goes into things that we take for granted in this day and age, that a young woman can come up to the bima. We take it for granted, but it is hard to believe not too long ago it wasn't something that was taken for granted. So thank God we can do that today, and I encourage our young to continue to speak to people like Dr. Musher and to learn more about what happened. Thank you, Dr. Musher.